Welcome and greetings to all of you who've joined us today. I'm Linda Gustitis, co-director of the Washington office of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School. And with me today is Professor Marjorie Sarbaugh-Thompson of the Political Science Department at Wayne State University and co-author of the research report on oversight in state legislatures, and Emily Van Baar, our program manager at the Levin Center. We're using a Zoom webinar program, as you know, so only the three of us are on video and audio, and the rest of you are able to see and hear us, but not participate directly. You can, however, submit questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can choose to submit a question anonymously or to identify yourself or your state. The Levin Center at Wayne State Law School was established in 2015 to honor the work and public service of Michigan's longest-serving senator, Carl Levin. One aspect of his service in the Senate, for which he was recognized, was his work on bipartisan fact-based oversight, and promoting that through trainings and research and fellowships has been a principal goal of the Levin Center. In that vein, we commissioned a study of all 50 states to assess the capacity and use of legislative oversight of the executive branch in each state. The study took almost 2 years, and you can read more about the background of the study and the detailed fact-finding on the study's website, which is stateoversightmap.org. When you visit that website, you'll see that we tried to present the findings of the study in a way that is reader-friendly for each state and for the various topics addressed by the study. You'll see that the states are also ranked for both capacity and use of oversight. There is an enormous amount of information in this study, but Professor Sarbaugh-Thompson will try to summarize the findings and recommendations in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And we will then have 15 to 20 minutes for her to answer any questions that you might have. Let me add that based on this research, the Levin Center has begun to provide trainings for state legislators and their staffs on how to do meaningful, bipartisan, fact-based oversight. And you can reach out to us by email at levincenter@wayne.edu. If you or others in your state would be interested in learning more about our trainings or having us conduct such a training, we'd be happy to do that in your state. I'll now ask Professor Sarbaugh-Thompson to summarize the findings and recommendations of the report, and then we will turn to the questions. Marjorie?
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. And I'm going to put some PowerPoint slides up here and try and give you a little bit of an idea of how we approached doing the research. As you all, I'm sure, are aware, state legislative oversight is a very important part of the state government process. It's a fundamental part of the checks and balances, and it's also become increasingly important because states are more and more delivering services, often with pass-through dollars from the federal government. We took a fairly broad view of oversight, looking at everything from performance audits, appropriations processes, administrative rule reviews, advice and consent. We did skip casework. We don't deny that that's an important part of oversight and part of your jobs, but we did have a lot on our plates with everything we were already looking at. The way we approached this was to write summaries for all 50 states. We started out by doing a document search. We read chamber rules, we looked at your state constitutions, we looked at websites for what we call the analytic support agencies. That would be like your fiscal agencies, your auditor general, or your state auditor office. And we wanted to find out how many performance audits were produced, that's separate from fiscal audits. And we also wanted to find out more about your auditors general and how closely they worked with the legislature. And then we listened to legislative committee hearings in the states where they were available and we could view them online. And we tried to get a sample of committees, oversight, standing, appropriations, interim. We also looked at the state media sources, the newspaper that was in the state capitol often. We were looking for scandals and crises, not because we were interested in scandalous things, but because those were things where we felt like there might be an opportunity for there to be oversight so that we could follow up and see what the linkage was. And then we tried to follow up with phone interviews with staff and legislators, sometimes with media sources. We had reasonably good luck getting people to return our calls, and we tried to verify what we were finding with your expertise. The content of the state summaries is sort of a standard template. It's the template that you see on the screen right now. We started out describing the state, then we described the analytic support agencies, then we moved into the production of performance audits from the auditor's office and so on. Then we moved to the appropriations process and whether there was a large amount or various styles of oversight conducted during the appropriations process. We looked at the standing committees, especially if there was a committee specifically tasked with oversight. We also tried to work through the administrative rule review process, which is quite complicated in many of your states. And then we looked at the various powers of advice and consent that different states grant the legislature over the governor's actions. And we also looked at any sunset action legislation, sunset and sunrise processes that the state might have. The main thing we were trying to produce was best practices, to survey the states and look for things that we found particularly innovative, effective in terms of helping that particular state conduct oversight. What we found is that many states excel in some facets of oversight, but they may not do as much in other facets. So some states make heavy use of performance audits and work very closely with the Auditor General. Others don't do as much of that, but they might have a very extensive sunset review process, or they might review administrative rules very thoroughly. So one of the things that we came away thinking was that all the states, regardless of their strengths in different areas, could learn from each other's practices because nobody got a perfect score on everything. Legislators, we found, need performance audits in order to have evidence so that they can do what Linda described as bipartisan, evidence-based, solution-driven oversight. That was what we were really trying to find, not partisan gotcha politics, which can sometimes invade oversight. We found that the way that the state chooses its legislative auditors sometimes makes a difference in the relationship between the legislature and the audit agencies. 25 states, so half, elect a state auditor. Some of the elected auditors produce no performance audits. Other elected auditors produce a lot of performance audits. Of the states that elect their auditors, 13 of them, slightly more than, or well, roughly half, also have a legislatively appointed auditor. So they actually have two auditors or audit agencies. Then 22 states have only a legislatively appointed auditor. They don't have an elected state auditor. And then 3 states have completely unique systems, some with a governor choosing from a panel of people to provide an auditor that the legislature works with. The best practice that we found that we would recommend is that state legislators and auditors, regardless of how the auditor is chosen, need to work closely together. In states where the legislative auditor didn't have close ties with the legislator, there seemed to be more difficulty in getting the information that legislators wanted. This might be because in some states, the legislators were not able to request specific audits from the agencies. We also found that in some states with award-winning audit agencies, legislative committees rarely held any hearings on audit reports. And we also found some states where even though hearings were held, there was little or no legislation that was introduced to address the audit findings. So one of the things that we really encouraged was ways to tighten that linkage between the audit agencies and the legislature. We also found that states that required that performance audits receive a legislative hearing, um, felt that they did a better job of monitoring state agencies. And I have examples after some of these best practices. If you've looked in the full report at the appendix that enumerates all of the best practices, you'll find that there are many, many states for several of these. I just chose a couple as examples, but I want to especially mention the state of Washington, because citizens had a ballot initiative that they passed that requires that the legislature review each of the performance audits. And not only were citizens committed enough to pass this ballot initiative, in that ballot initiative, they provided some funding for performance audits. Colorado took a different route. They passed a state law in the legislature, but both of those states are examples of states where every performance audit receives a hearing. Some states create a report at the end of every legislative session that's published, that's available online, that we could search easily and look at without any special access, that identified what the legislature had done with respect to all of the different audit findings. And South Carolina and California were examples of states that did this, although there were others. And then we found that a lot of part-time legislatures appoint an interim committee to follow up on problems that are identified in performance audits. And the part-time legislatures, some of them only meet 3 months a year, so their calendar's pretty packed when they're in session. And so often they would identify people to put on a committee. They paid them a daily rate. They would come to a location in the state, often staying for anywhere from 2 to 4 days, sleeping in the same hotel or motel, eating in the same restaurants, and really kind of did total immersion in a particular problem. Often there were sort of field trips to a particular site that was involved in the oversight. Montana and Nevada were states that were examples of this, but there were several states that we were quite impressed with the intensity with which they pursued oversight. And I think one of the things that was helpful was there wasn't a lot of other legislative activity, budgets and bills and so on to distract them. So it was a very concentrated effort at oversight. There are often in many states a particular committee tasked with oversight, that it's their primary responsibility. And some states have laws or chamber rules or constitutional requirements that mean that the party membership on just these oversight committees or some other related specialized committees are balanced by party membership. For example, in Idaho, during the session that we were looking at in the lower chamber, there were 6 Democrats in the entire legislature, but legally there are 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans in the rule that we looked at who have to be on this oversight committee. So it's exactly balanced in terms of political party. There were actually 13 states that did this. And then one more state, Connecticut, appoints an auditor from each political party to try and ensure that oversight doesn't decrease during periods of one-party government. And that is something we found consistently across states that didn't do something to try and provide the minority party with a voice, is that during periods of one-party government, oversight does decline. Another best practice was having joint chamber oversight committees. And this is actually a pretty efficient use of audit staff's time. Some of the audit hearings that we listened to went on for a couple days, and they were sometimes 6 to 8 hour days, each of them. And there were several staff from the audit agency who were sitting there working through the audit report with the committee members. And then if you have to repeat that process with the other chamber, that's a large consumption of time from your audit staff. And most states um, we found I had requests from audit staff for more funding, and so it's a good idea to use this resource fairly efficiently. It also is a way, on the rare occasions that there are two chambers that are not controlled by the same political party, then you would have a balance of partisan input into the process by having a joint chamber meetings. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at the administrative rule process, and the administrative rule review process is incredibly complicated in a lot of states. We tried doing flow charts to map through the decision points, and they go on for pages some of the time. So the states are very, very different on this. But looking at things that we could say in common across the state, is there's a very heavy focus on the cost of administrative rules. And there's no denying that there is a cost to regulation, but there also are often very great benefits, particularly to public health and public welfare, from administrative rules. For example, clean water kinds of rules. Those sorts of things are very beneficial. And one of the states that systematically considers the benefits of administrative rules is Minnesota. And we felt that that was a best practice that could be generalized across all this wide variety of administrative rule review processes. The other thing I would mention is that some states have a bipartisan rule review committee, as well as a bipartisan, or maybe they don't have a bipartisan oversight committee, but they do have a bipartisan rule review committee. And we felt that that was also a valuable place to have the minority party have voice in the oversight process. Some of the other best practices that I wanted to highlight, and this is obviously for those of you who've looked at the report, I'm just hitting a few key points out of the appendix on the best practices. But there are some states that provide really nice video recording links to oversight hearings, and there's software that some states have bought that creates an automated transcript that accompanies the recordings. Obviously, it's a computer transcript with all the glitches that voice recognition sometimes comes up with, but you can click on, they're time-stamped, you can click on them and it will link you to the video recording so that you can hear what actually happened. So if you're trying to follow a particular issue, this is very helpful for citizens and for people in your states. Montana had an especially good system when we looked at their website. Then we also found that states that had analytic bureaucracies that were heavily engaged in the sunset rule review process were better able to cope with the demands of that process. Only a small number of states have sunset rule review processes, but those that relied heavily on the analytic bureaucratic staff were able to navigate that process and use it more effectively, we felt. The last thing I wanted to highlight is something that many states seem to be struggling with, and that a lot of state legislators mentioned in the hearings when we were listening to them. And we found some of these really troubling instances because they were private contractors delivering services where people were harmed. Management of foster care system, management of juvenile detention facilities, prison food services. All of these were private contractors, and there were instances in some different states where people died or were seriously harmed because of the action of the private contractors. Some of the state legislators that we listened to expressed very grave concerns about their lack of access to information that they needed to monitor these private contractors. And this is not with respect to financial management. This is with respect to the delivery and the quality of the services delivered with the taxpayers' dollars. A few states are developing some systems to audit the performance of private contractors. Idaho and Alabama were among the ones, but most of these are fledgling efforts, and a lot of states are struggling with this and approaching it by getting a performance audit of the state agency that has the contract in order to kind of work around the existing impediments to directly having a performance audit of the private contractors. So this is something where I think that states could share their experiences and what they're finding works and some of the frustrations that they're experiencing with this situation. Now, we've obviously just scratched the surface here with what's in the report, and I'm sure we have just scratched the surface with all the things that the states are doing, because we were actually incredibly impressed with the activities of a lot of the states. We hope you'll take a look at the Levin Center website, especially the appendix with the best practices. We also hope that states, that we might initiate some dialogue between the states so that they could share information among themselves about what works with their neighboring states, with states across in other regions of the country. And we want to thank you for listening, and especially we want to thank you for those of you who responded to our calls and emails asking for your help in identifying what your states do. And I've put up the link to the full report and to the maps just to remind people of where you can go to get more information. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Marjorie, that you and your team did a terrific job on that report, and we are very grateful to you for doing that. And that was a terrific summary. That was a lot of information to put into a very short period of time. Remember, for those of you who are on the webinar, you can ask a question by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you have a question for Marjorie. But I'm going to go ahead and start with a first question, Marjorie. States vary greatly, obviously, on the level of professionalism of their staffs and legislators, with wide differences in pay, for example, length of legislative session, number of staff. Did you find that the level of professionalism in a state legislature affected the quality of the oversight?
Actually, the first time that we presented this research in public, everybody's reaction was, oh, it's just going to be how many resources they have, how long they're in session. It'll just be the professionalism will predict all of it. If you look at our ratings of the states, you will find that a lot of part-time legislatures got some very high marks. And a lot of this, I think, has to do with this approach that they've taken with the interim committee meetings in the summertime when they're not in session, and the concentrated effort that is being put forward, and the lack of distractions, so that people are really focusing heavily on oversight. I don't think there's any denying that having more resources is correlated with producing more performance audits. But as I mentioned, a lot of states that produce a lot of performance audits, the legislature doesn't necessarily meet and hold hearings on them or make use of that. So I don't think, contrary to what everybody told us when we were starting out, I don't think the evidence shows that having more staff resources is necessarily a silver bullet. And there's just a mixture of states, and it depends on a lot of factors. But I think the main factor is how committed states are to using the performance audit information that their audit agencies produce.
So at this point, we don't have any questions from our audience, so I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask you a couple more, and that is, when you refer to sunset review, how do you define that? Are there lots of different ways to do a sunset review, or types of sunset review in the states?
Yes. And a lot of states do not have sunset reviews. Sunset reviews were very popular, as one of the reform movements, because there've been a whole lot of different cycles of reform movements, starting really back in the 1960s. The reform movement that was popular then was trying to get auditors general in all of the states that were linked to the legislature. And actually the Connecticut legislature worked with the Eagleston Institute, and they proliferated this experimental model and then went out and tried to convince other states to adopt it. And it has been widely adopted. Most of the states do have a legislative auditor, 35 of them total.
Right.
Have a legislative auditor. So another wave that came along was what was called sunrise and sunset review. Some states have both. Sunrise review was not as popular. That means that prior to being able to promulgate a rule, a state agency would have to have permission from the legislature and sort of pre-clearance of the rule. So
Mhm.
after a law passes, there would be like a preliminary process. States that have a sunset review process have various different lengths of time, so that there might be all rules have to be reviewed every 7 years, and it's on a rotating cycle. And if you think about that, one of the reasons that we stress the value of the analytic bureaucracy staff in doing this, if you're going to try and review every single rule in an entire state on a 7-year cycle, that's a huge number of rules.
Yeah.
And the rules are often very detailed. And so this is a huge project. A lot of states have abandoned the sunset review process simply because of the time and the cost. And a lot of rules people look at and they just continue them. And so one of the things we were looking for when we were looking at the sunset process, is there ever a rule that is rejected? And some of the times, even in states that had a sunset review process, we couldn't find any rules that had been terminated. And that was the sort of question where we would call staff or other people in the state and say, do you know of any time when any of the rules actually were terminated? And so states have sort of tried to make modifications so that there are only certain things that get reviewed and it's only periodically, but some states are still reviewing virtually all their rules on some very short time frames, which is a very demanding task, which is why we said some states are doing extraordinary things with administrative rule review in terms of oversight. They might not be doing very much with performance audits, probably because time is finite. And
Right.
there are only 24 hours in a day. I can't figure out how to get more.
Right. Okay, thank you. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this question, but we do have a couple questions now from the audience. And this one comes out of North Carolina. The person said, my concerns are there are needed changes in North Carolina for oversight. According to your report, DHHS is currently receiving $2.5 billion in non-bid contracts, yet they're creating issues. North Carolina is high in appropriations and analytical bureaucracies, yet limited in committees and monitoring contracts, according to the report. So how can a nonprofit that's interested in getting involved get the assistance through these committees, such as, and then she lists the committees, PED and JKPEOC, which I don't know, but they're obviously relevant committees that deal with these contracts. So she's kind of saying, how do you get the attention to these committees when the committee oversight system is weak?
Yeah, and that obviously is a problem. You know, I wouldn't be shy about talking to the media. One of our best practices that we mentioned kind of at the beginning was that or one of the ways that we looked for things was to call the state media. And there's a lot of coverage of things we found that after it hits the newspapers, then it would show up in a committee hearing. And so I think the media have a role to play in alerting the public that there is this problem with part of the private contracting system. And that then provides some motivation for the committees. But there also is a problem writ large in the states that the contracts tend to be monitored by the executive branch in most states. And this was what we found legislators in several states expressing frustration about, was that they were having a hard time, even when their committee process was fairly rigorous, getting access to the information that they wanted about the private contractors. And so that this is a place where I think states nationally could put together any sorts of practices that they're finding that work to try and extract some of this information. And I know that there are some states, that were talking about it. I can remember some committee hearings where the state legislators were saying, well, what we really need is more information directly from this contractor. So I think there's movement afoot nationally to make some progress, but in the particular instances, I'd go to the media. I would
get it started there.
Yeah, I would get the ball rolling with some public attention. And
Um,
ballot initiative states, which North Carolina doesn't have the luxury of a Washington or an Oregon or the states that have the ballot initiative, but states where people have the ballot initiative, if you're part of a nonprofit, there's certainly room to look at what Washington state did and try and use the public forum to insist that there will be some auditing and some hearings and some public documents about what happens in those oversight hearings. Because I think the public, if we assume that Washington state is not atypical, it seems pretty clear that the public cares about this part of government.
We do have another question, and that is, are there any best practices that help legislatures figure out how to set priorities on oversight? Is there a way that legislatures decide what they should focus on?
That's not one that we really discovered, and probably my reaction would be that of any of the best practices that we have that would be relevant to that, it would be this business of having a bipartisan sort of approach where you have both political parties with balanced input so that both parties on both sides of the aisle can say, hey, we want some questions asked about this particular process or this particular agency program that we do or don't feel is being delivered the way we'd like to.
We've been working with a couple states that have committees like that, bipartisan oversight committees, and they seem to be very effective and meaningful. Really a significant help to the legislature and to the quality of public policy in the state. So I think those committees are a really good best practice.
Yeah, and I listened to a couple of committee hearings in states that have that arrangement. And in one of them in particular, I could not tell who the R's and D's in the room from the questions and the statements. And it was much more about how are we going to solve this problem that is clearly a problem for everybody. And just to clarify for people, we tried not to choose hot button issues to the extent that we could. Now, we did follow up on some that came up in media reports. But for example, we looked in my own state of Michigan, we looked at a hearing about the persistence of bovine TB, which is present in cows and has led to a quarantine in the state of Michigan of some of 5 counties' dairy herds. And bovine TB does not care whether you have an R or a D after your name. If it is transmittable across from cows to people, and it should concern all of us whether or not we're encouraging the state agencies in charge of that to monitor that really carefully.
As a last question here, let me ask, what would be the best advice from you as a result of the report to the states that rank near the bottom on these rankings? What's the most important thing that they can do at this moment, besides ask the 11th Center to come in and help train them? What else is a good suggestion for state legislatures?
Well, we found 5 states that during the year that we studied them produced no audit reports performance audit reports at all. They produced financial audits. They did the statewide single audit, those sorts of audits, but there were no performance audits on what is the quality of service delivery, of particular agencies. Those states, I would say there's a crying need to provide the resources for the audit staff to do performance audits. And performance audits are not cheap to do. So I sympathize that states that have limited budgets, this is a difficult challenge, but it's clearly you have to have some evidence if you're going to discuss performance with states. So that would be one of the first things to do. Another thing that I would encourage states to do is once you have the performance audits, even if you only have one or two of them, use them. Call in the audit staff, call in the agencies, call in some people who might be affected. The Bovine TB hearing that I listened to, that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, there were a lot of farmers at that hearing. There are a lot of citizens in the community that you could have come into hearings and give testimony who might be affected by programs. I think, sort of a more systematic effort to then have the hearing and then document what you did as a result of the hearing. Was there legislation introduced? Was there a change in the agency rules? What was actually done? And that kind of follow through, working with the media, could be publicized in the state news media. There are other, forums to let citizens know that legislators are actually taking that kind of action. And, it just becomes sort of a routine process. So it doesn't mean that you have to have the most resources as the part-time legislatures demonstrate. You can have some hearings during the summer, you can have part-time legislatures and limited staff, but you have to make some pretty efficient use of that staff.
Okay, I do have a couple more questions that just popped in. We have one question which is, how many states require audit findings be addressed? This person says, in my state, there's no law telling agencies or the legislature that they must correct their audit findings. In fact, agencies may not agree with the audit findings and the suggested recommendations. So the question to you is, how many states do require that audit findings be addressed? Do you know?
I would have to look at the report. I don't have all the numbers memorized. It's not a majority, though.
It's not a majority.
Very definitely not a majority. I would say it's close to 10, then, so there's a lot of room for improvement there, because once you've paid for the audit report, it seems to me unfortunate that it's not used as extensively as it could be. There's one instance of a state that had 30 very top-notch audit reports, and there were 3 hearings held that covered 3 of those audit reports. So that's 27 reports that did not get a hearing. So, that it isn't widespread, the idea that all of these are going to get a hearing. And some of them could be probably fairly short hearings. But then, as I mentioned, there were a few major audit reports with lots of problems where there were multiple day hearings.
Okay. And then I have a couple questions about what the Levin Center's proposal is in terms of responding to the report. And the Levin Center has established and is trying to grow a program to train state legislators in how you do an oversight investigation or a hearing. We do 2-day boot camps where we actually walk through an issue and how you identify the information, how you get the facts, how you get documents, how you choose witnesses, how you interview people, how you hold hearings. We call that a 2-day boot camp. We can have a 1-day session where we come in and talk to a committee about how they can be more effective in terms of oversight, and we can do a half-day event. So it's really, we're able to try to match states' needs with our abilities with the state's needs. So And we also have materials that we are developing that we can also make available to states. So I just want to remind you that if you're interested in that at all, you can reach out to us at our website or at our email address. And let me urge you again to please visit the website, because it is loaded with information. One other element is we are considering hosting in Detroit, Michigan, an event for all state legislatures to come and talk about these issues and to share the best practices and to identify ways to improve the best practices, but also for states to learn how they can initiate these best practices. So if there's any interest by anybody out there in the Levin Center hosting that, we would be very interested in hearing from you and in hearing that there's a strong enough interest out there for us to do that. So with that, I think I will thank you all for participating in the webinar. If you would take a few minutes to respond to our survey, which we'll be emailing out to evaluate the session, that would be great. And I just got, and you can do that by, as it's just on our website here, it's at levincenter@wayne.edu. Again, remember that you can go and find the full report at stateoversight.org. So thanks again to everybody, and thank you again, Marjorie, for doing such a great job on that report. Thank you, Emily, for pulling all of this, the logistics together for us, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.